Sometimes the moment that changes everything arrives when you have nothing left to lose. For Clara Whitmore, that moment came on a dusty platform in Cedar Ridge, wearing a torn dress and carrying only shame. She'd travelled 2,000 miles as a mail-order bride to marry a stranger. The townsfolk gathered to stare and whisper at her disgrace. Then he appeared, a tall mountain man with weathered hands and eyes that saw past her rags. He looked at her torn clothes and trembling hope, and he smiled. "You've brought all I need," he said quietly. Those 6 words would change her life forever. What did this broken woman carry that a man who needed nothing would treasure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Clara Whitmore sat in a cramped boarding house room in Philadelphia, surrounded by the last remnants of a life that had crumbled like old parchment. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing water stains that mapped out her decline as clearly as any ledger. Outside, rain drummed against the window, and somewhere below, Mrs. Kellerman was shouting about overdue rent again. Clara held the newspaper in trembling hands, her eyes fixed on a single advertisement in the back pages, nestled between notices for farm equipment and patent medicines. Honest man, seeking honest wife. Mountain homestead in Colorado Territory. Must be of good character and willing spirit. Physical beauty matters not. Write to Ezra Cole, Cedar Ridge. She'd read it 17 times over 3 days. Each time, her heart performed the same peculiar leap, half hope and half terror. The room felt smaller with each passing hour. On the narrow bed lay her mother's silver brush, tarnished now, and a miniature portrait of her father, a kind-faced man who died 2 years prior, leaving nothing but debts and apologies. Her own reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman of 26 who looked older, with dark circles under hazel eyes and cheekbones too prominent from skipped meals. She thought of Marcus Ashford, with his tailored suits and easy promises, how he'd courted her when her father was alive and the debts weren't yet known, how he'd spoken of marriage, of a house on Chestnut Street, of a life that glittered like the crystal chandeliers in his family's dining room, and how quickly he'd vanished when her father's creditors came calling, taking with him not just his promises, but her reputation. The whispers had started immediately. She must have done something improper. No decent man abandons a lady without cause. Perhaps she's not as innocent as she appears. The truth mattered less than the gossip. Within months, Clara Whitmore had become untouchable in Philadelphia society. Even positions as a governess or companion were denied her. Respectable families wanted nothing to do with a woman tainted by scandal, no matter how false. Clara picked up her pen. The ink was running low, but she had just enough for one more letter. She'd written to Ezra Cole twice before, each letter more honest than she'd ever been with Marcus. She'd told him about her father's death, about the debts, about her lack of dowry or prospects. She'd admitted she knew nothing of frontier life, that her hands were soft from a city upbringing, that she couldn't cook much beyond tea and toast. His responses had surprised her. Written in a careful, measured hand on rough paper, they spoke not of what she lacked, but of what she might become. He told her about the mountain country, about seasons that turned the aspens gold, and winters that demanded strength but rewarded it with crystalline beauty. He wrote of silence that wasn't lonely but peaceful, of work that tired the body but satisfied the soul. He never mentioned love, but his words carried a quiet respect that Marcus's flowery promises never had. "I won't lie to you," he'd written in his most recent letter. "Life here is hard, the cabin is small, the nearest neighbor is 5 miles down the mountain. Winter snows can trap you for weeks, but it's honest work and honest country, and I'm an honest man. I'd treat you with the respect due a wife and partner. I'd never raise my hand to you, never speak to you with cruelty, never abandon you to face hardship alone. If you can accept a simple life and simple companionship, I believe we could build something decent together." Clara had cried when she read those words, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being offered exactly what she needed most: decency, honesty, and a chance to start over. She wrote back, accepting his proposal. The journey west had taken 3 weeks. Clara sold everything. She couldn't carry her mother's jewelry, the good linens, even her father's books. She bought the cheapest stage passage, rationing her remaining money for the unknown expenses ahead. In her carpet bag, she packed 2 dresses, some underthings, her father's broken pocket watch, and the leather journal containing all of Ezra's letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The stagecoach had been a brutal education. She learned that frontier travel meant dust in your teeth, cramps in your legs, and conversations with rough men who stared too long. She learned that rest stops were muddy yards behind questionable establishments, and that accommodations often meant a shared room with strangers and bedbugs. She learned all of this and endured it, telling herself that at the end waited a man who'd promised honesty and respect, a man who'd seen her brokenness on paper and hadn't turned away. The attack came on the second-to-last day of travel. 4 men on horseback, faces covered with bandanas, stopped the stage 20 miles outside Cedar Ridge. They took money, jewelry, anything of value. One of them grabbed Clara's carpet bag and dumped it in the dirt, laughing at her meager possessions. Another tore at her sleeve, seeking hidden valuables, ripping the fabric of her best blue dress from shoulder to elbow. The driver fired his shotgun in the air, scattering the thieves, but the damage was done. Clara sat in the dirt, gathering her scattered belongings with shaking hands, her dress torn and ruined, her small savings gone. The other passengers, a mining engineer and an elderly couple, helped her back into the coach, offering awkward sympathy but no real solutions. She had nothing now, just a torn dress, a broken watch, a journal of letters from a stranger, and a wedding band that had belonged to her grandmother, hidden in her corset because she'd learned to be cautious about where she kept what little remained precious. When the stage finally rolled into Cedar Ridge, Clara's hands were clenched so tight her nails left crescents in her palms. Through the window, she saw a collection of rough buildings huddled against the mountain landscape: a general store, a saloon, a small church, maybe 20 structures in all. The station was just a covered platform with a bench and a water trough. And people, too many people, gathered as if her arrival was entertainment. Clara stepped down from the stage, feeling every eye upon her. She heard the whispers immediately. "Lord above, look at her dress. Did she get attacked? Poor thing looks half-starved. Is that the bride for Ezra Cole? Wonder if he'll still take her." Looking like that. She stood there, alone on that platform, wearing a torn dress and carrying a battered bag, feeling shame burn through her like fever. She'd come all this way, survived so much, only to arrive looking like a beggar. What man would want to claim her now? What man would stand before this crowd and acknowledge her as his intended wife? For a terrible moment, Clara thought about getting back on the stage, riding it to wherever it went next, starting over somewhere else, somewhere no one was watching her disgrace. Then the crowd parted. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of hard work. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, somewhere in his late 30s, Clara guessed. He wore simple clothes, a work shirt and canvas pants and boots that had seen many miles, and he carried a hat in his hands as he walked toward her. His eyes were grey, like storm clouds, and they looked directly at her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. Ezra Cole stopped 3 feet away, studying her with that steady gaze. Clara waited for disgust, for disappointment, for the polite withdrawal that would leave her stranded. Instead, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it reached his eyes and softened them. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'm glad you've come." Clara tried to speak, but her throat had closed with emotion. She managed a small nod instead, and that seemed to be enough. Ezra moved closer, and she caught the scent of pine and wood smoke. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat a heavy wool garment that still held the warmth of his body and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so natural, so unhurried, that it didn't feel like charity, it felt like care. "You've had a rough journey," he said, his eyes moving briefly to her torn sleeve before returning to her face. "We'll get you sorted out." The coat engulfed her, warm and protective. Clara pulled it tighter, feeling the first crack in the dam of her composure. She would not cry in front of these strangers. She would not. "The stage was robbed," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "They took everything, my bag, my money. I have nothing, nothing of value to bring to—" "You're here," Ezra interrupted quietly. "That's what matters." Behind them, the crowd was still murmuring. Clara caught fragments. "He's really taking her. Must be desperate. Wonder what kind of woman comes west looking like that." Ezra must have heard them too, because his jaw tightened slightly. He turned, not dramatically, just a simple pivot, and looked at the gathered townsfolk. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. Something in his steady gaze made them shuffle and look away, conversations dying like embers kicked apart. He turned back to Clara and offered his arm. "General store's just there. Miss Sarah keeps a good selection. We'll get you what you need." Clara hesitated. "I can't pay." "I can." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Come on now. You must be tired." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. They walked together across the dusty street, and Clara felt the weight of watching eyes follow them all the way to the general store's wooden steps. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, leather, and dried herbs. A woman, perhaps 10 years older than Clara, stood behind the counter, her face kind and curious. She wore a practical calico dress and had her brown hair pulled back in a sensible bun. "Ezra," she said warmly, then her gaze moved to Clara and softened even more. "And you must be Miss Whitmore. I'm Sarah Fletcher. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity either, which Clara appreciated even more. Just straightforward kindness. "Sarah, we need some things," Ezra said. "A good dress, sturdy, boots if you've got them in her size, undergarments, whatever a woman needs, and a proper coat for the mountain." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the shelves. "Of course. Miss Whitmore, come back here and let's get you measured properly." Clara glanced at Ezra, uncertain. He gave her an encouraging nod. "I'll settle the account. Take your time." In the back room, among bolts of fabric and ready-made garments, Sarah worked with efficient kindness. She didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't comment on Clara's torn dress or her visible distress. She simply measured and selected, occasionally holding up an item and asking Clara's preference. "The blue or the brown?" Sarah asked, holding up 2 simple day dresses. "I can't, this is too much," Clara said, overwhelmed. "I don't know when I can repay." "Ezra's good for it," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "And between you and me, that man has saved more than he's spent for years. Lives simple up in those mountains, never buys anything he doesn't need. If he's spending money on you, it's because he wants to. Let him." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I've arrived with nothing. No dowry, no trousseau, nothing a proper wife should bring, just debts and disgrace." Sarah set down the dresses and looked at Clara directly. "Did Ezra know about your circumstances before you came?" "I told him everything in my letters, the debts, the scandal, all of it." "And he still sent for you?" Clara nodded. "Then he's already made his choice, hasn't he?" Sarah's smile was gentle. "Ezra Cole is the most deliberate man I know. He doesn't do anything without thinking it through. If he wanted a rich bride or a fancy one, he'd have said so in his advertisement. He asked for honest and willing. Seems to me you're both of those things." The words settled into Clara's chest, warm and steadying. She chose the blue dress. When she emerged from the back room wearing her new clothes, Clara felt more herself than she had in months. The dress was simple cotton, but it was clean and whole and fit her properly. The boots were sturdy leather, broken in enough to be comfortable. Sarah had even included a warm shawl. Ezra stood near the front counter, talking quietly with an older man, the station master, Clara assumed. He looked up when she approached, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a quiet appreciation. "Better," he said simply. Clara noticed a bundle wrapped in brown paper on the counter, clearly more supplies he'd purchased. She also noticed the worn leather satchel at his feet, presumably what he'd brought to carry everything back. The station master, a grey-haired fellow with friendly eyes, tipped his hat to Clara. "Albert Finch, ma'am. Welcome to Cedar Ridge. You'll be in good hands with Ezra." "Thank you," Clara managed. Ezra settled his account with Sarah, counted out bills from a worn wallet without hesitation. Then he gathered the parcels, shouldered the satchel, and turned to Clara. "There's something we should discuss," he said. "Can we walk a bit?" Clara's stomach tightened with fresh anxiety, but she nodded. They left the store and walked down the main street, away from the busiest buildings. The afternoon sun slanted long across the mountains, painting everything in gold and amber. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Finally, he stopped near a small grove of aspens at the edge of town and turned to face her. "I've been thinking on the way here," he said, "about how this must look to folks, about how you must be feeling, arriving the way you did, and I've got a proposal for you, if you'll hear it." Clara waited, her heart hammering. "We could get married today," Ezra said. "Right now, if you're willing. There's a minister in town, and Albert and Sarah would stand as witnesses. It would give you my name, my protection. Nobody could say anything about you, then you'd be Mrs. Cole, a married woman, respectable. But you barely know me," Clara whispered. "I know what you've written to me over these months. I know you're honest enough to admit your troubles instead of hiding them. I know you had the courage to come 2,000 miles on faith alone. I know you got robbed and hurt and still got off that stage instead of riding it back to wherever it came from." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "That tells me what I need to know about your character. What if I'm not what you hoped for? What if I can't be the wife you need? What if you are?" He countered gently. "What if we both get a second chance at something decent?" Clara's hands trembled. "I have nothing to give you. No dowry, no household goods. No." Ezra reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple silver ring, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "It's not fancy, but it's honest. Like her, like me, like you." He held it out to her. "I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. Not yet. I'm asking you to trust me, to give us both a chance to build something real. Will you?" The ring caught the fading sunlight, glowing soft and warm. Clara thought of everything she'd lost, everything she'd survived, every step that had brought her to this moment. She thought of Ezra's letters, written with such careful consideration. She thought of his coat around her shoulders, his steady presence, the way he'd looked at her torn dress and seen past it to her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." The ceremony was brief and simple. The minister, an old preacher named Reverend Thomas, performed the service in the small church as the sun set beyond the windows. Albert and Sarah stood as witnesses, their faces warm with approval. Clara wore her new blue dress and Ezra's mother's ring. Ezra wore his work clothes and spoke his vows in that same steady, certain voice. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Ezra took Clara's hand gently, respectfully, and brushed his thumb across her knuckles. It was not a passionate gesture, but it was sincere. "Mrs. Cole," he said, trying out the name. "Mr. Cole," she replied, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but hope, real hope, for the first time in longer than she could remember. They spent the night at the boarding house, separate rooms, Ezra insisted, despite Sarah's teasing that they were married now. "She's had a hard journey," he said simply. "Let her rest proper." In her small, clean room, Clara lay in an actual bed for the first time in weeks. She touched the silver ring on her finger, turning it slowly, feeling its weight. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the frontier town settling into evening. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, someone played a fiddle. She was married. To a stranger who'd shown her more kindness in an afternoon than Marcus had in months of courtship. To a man who'd looked at her in her shame and seen someone worth protecting. Clara closed her eyes and let herself imagine the mountain cabin Ezra had described in his letters. Let herself imagine learning to build a life in that remote place. Let herself imagine, just possibly, being happy. Tomorrow, he'd told her, they would begin the journey up to his homestead. Tomorrow, her new life would truly start. For the first time in 2 years, Clara Cole, fell asleep without fear. Spring arrived in the mountains with a rush of meltwater and the urgent green of new growth. Clara had survived her first mountain winter long, cold, isolating, but also strangely peaceful. The forced closeness with Ezra during those snowed-in weeks had deepened their companionship into something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. One morning in late April, Clara stood in the clearing near the cabin, looking at the patch of earth where last year's garden had been. The soil was dark and rich from winter's work, ready for new life. "I want to plant a real garden this year," she told Ezra over breakfast. "Not just a few vegetables, a proper garden. Herbs, flowers maybe. Something that will make this place feel more like home." Ezra considered this, chewing his bread thoughtfully. "Town's got a decent general store. Sarah keeps seed packets this time of year. We could ride down, get what you need." Clara's heart lifted at the prospect. She'd been to Cedar Ridge only once since their wedding day, a brief trip for winter supplies that had left her feeling exposed and uncomfortable. But spring felt different. She felt different, stronger, more certain of her place here. They made the journey 2 days later. The mountain trail was muddy, but passable, and the ride gave Clara time to appreciate how much she'd changed in 6 months. She no longer felt awkward on the wagon bench, no longer startled at every shadow in the forest. The mountains had become familiar, almost friendly. Cedar Ridge was busier than she remembered, full of people emerging from winter isolation to trade goods and share news. As they drove down the main street, Clara noticed the stares, some curious, some disapproving, some openly sympathetic. At the general store, Sarah greeted them with genuine warmth. "Clara, Ezra, good to see you both. How was winter up on the mountain?" "Quiet," Ezra said, "which suited us fine." Sarah smiled knowingly. "I bet it did. What brings you down?" "Seed packets," Clara said. "I want to start a proper garden." "Oh, wonderful." Sarah led them to a display of small paper packets, each illustrated with colorful drawings of vegetables and flowers. "I've got everything: tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, and here," she pulled out several packets from a special section. "These are flower seeds. Not practical, maybe, but they make life prettier." Clara selected her seeds carefully, discussing each choice with Sarah, who had years of gardening experience. Ezra watched from a few feet away, occasionally offering observations but mostly content to let Clara make her own decisions. They were examining a packet of lavender seeds when the bell above the door jangled and a sharp voice cut through the store's pleasant atmosphere. "Well, well, if it isn't the mail-order bride." Clara turned to see a well-dressed woman in her 40s, with carefully styled hair and a pinched expression. 2 other women flanked her, faces eager for drama. "Mrs. Henshaw," Sarah said, her tone cooling noticeably. "The woman, Mrs." Henshaw moved closer, her eyes raking over Clara with undisguised disdain. "I'm surprised you're still here, dear. Most women would have run back east by now. Must be desperate indeed to stay in that isolated cabin with a man you barely know. Clara felt heat rise in her face, old shame attempting to resurface. But before she could respond, Ezra moved to her side. "My wife," he said quietly, emphasis on the word wife, "is exactly where she belongs. Same as me." Mrs. Henshaw's lips thinned. "Everyone knows about her circumstances. Arriving here in rags, no family, no reputation to speak of. Surely you could have found someone more." "More what?" Ezra's voice remained calm, but steel threaded through it. "More concerned with appearances than substance, more interested in gossip than in honest work. If that's what you're suggesting, ma'am, then no thank you. I prefer my wife exactly as she is." The woman sputtered, colour flooding her cheeks. Her companions exchanged nervous glances. Sarah stepped forward, her cheerful demeanour replaced by something harder. "Mrs. Henshaw, unless you're here to buy something, I believe we're done. I've got customers to serve." Mrs. Henshaw gathered her dignity and swept toward the door. "Come, ladies, the air in here has become quite common." The door slammed behind them with unnecessary force. In the silence that followed, Clara found her voice. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Stop," Ezra said, turning to face her. "You didn't do anything wrong. She's a bitter woman who measures worth by bank accounts and pedigree. Don't let her words take root." "But she's right," Clara said miserably. "I did arrive in rags. I have no family, no reputation." "You have a family," Ezra interrupted firmly. "Me. And as for reputation, you've worked hard every day since you arrived. You learned to cook, to shoot, to survive a mountain winter. You've tended the cabin, mended clothes until your fingers bled, kept us fed through storms that would have broken softer people. That's reputation enough for any decent person." Clara's eyes burned with gratitude and something deeper. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know you," he said simply. "I see you every day, Clara. I see who you are when nobody's watching. That's worth more than all the fine pedigrees in Philadelphia." Sarah cleared her throat gently. "He's right, you know. You're well liked by the people who matter, the ones who judge by character instead of gossip. Mrs. Henshaw's just sour because her own daughter ran off with a gambler last year. She takes it out on anyone she can." The information settled Clara's nerves somewhat. She managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, both of you. Now then," Sarah said briskly, returning to business, "let's finish getting your seeds. I'm thinking you'll want some marigolds too. They keep the rabbits away from the vegetables." They completed their purchases and were loading supplies into the wagon when Albert, the station master, approached. He was a kind man in his 60s, weathered by frontier life, but gentle in manner. "Ezra, Clara, glad I caught you. Got something for you." He handed Ezra a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Came in on yesterday's stage, from Denver." Ezra frowned slightly, examining the parcel. "I didn't order anything from Denver." "Return address says it's from a lawyer's office," Albert said. "Figured it might be important." Clara felt ice slide down her spine. A lawyer's office. From Denver, which was close enough to Philadelphia that news could travel. What if Marcus had... "Let's head home," Ezra said, reading her expression. "We'll look at it there." The ride back seemed longer than the descent. Clara's mind spun with possibilities, each worse than the last. What if Marcus was pursuing legal action? What if he'd found out where she was? What if this new life, still so fragile, was about to shatter? At the cabin, Ezra unwrapped the parcel carefully. Inside was a letter on official-looking letterhead. Clara watched his face as he read, trying to interpret the tightening around his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. Finally he looked up. "It's from a lawyer named Margaret Hart. She represents women who've been defrauded by..." He checked the letter again. "By Marcus Ashford. Your Marcus." Clara's heart hammered. What does she want? She's building a case against him. Apparently he's done this before, courted women, made promises, then abandoned them and used legal threats to extort money. She's found at least 3 other women willing to testify. He held out the letter to Clara. She wants to know if you'll join them. Clara took the letter with shaking hands. The words swam before her eyes. Testimony, deposition, potential criminal charges, justice. He threatened to sue me for breach of promise, she said slowly, remembering. Right before I left. Said I'd damaged his reputation by refusing him. His lawyer sent letters demanding payment. Did you pay? I had nothing to pay with. That's partly why I came west. I thought if I was gone, he'd forget about me. Ezra's expression darkened. Men like that don't forget. They just move on to the next target. He sat down heavily at the table. The lawyer says he's now threatening another woman, a widow in Denver, demanding $5,000 or he'll ruin her socially and take her to court. $5,000, Clara whispered. That's impossible. That's the point. He doesn't expect payment. He expects terror, compliance, silence. Clara looked down at the letter again, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about justice for all of Marcus's victims. This was about stopping him from hurting anyone else. What do I do? She asked. Ezra met her eyes steadily. That's your choice, Clara. You don't owe anyone anything, not me, not these other women, not anybody. You've survived enough. If you want to let this go, leave the past buried, I'll support that. But, he said quietly, if you want to fight him, if you want to make sure he can't do this to another woman, I'll support that too. Whatever you decide, we face it together. Together. The word settled over Clara like a warm cloak. She thought of the girl she'd been in Philadelphia, ashamed, powerless, voiceless. She thought of the woman she was becoming here in the mountains, capable, strong, partnered with a man who saw her worth. She thought of other women, somewhere, facing what she'd faced, feeling what she'd felt. I want to fight, she said, her voice firm. I want to stop him. Ezra nodded once, decisive. Then we'll write to this lawyer, set things in motion. As Clara sat down to compose her response, she felt something shift inside her. Fear was still there, yes, but alongside it was something new, something fierce and righteous, and utterly unwilling to be silenced anymore. The garden grew as spring deepened into early summer. Clara tended it each morning, watching tiny green shoots push through the dark soil with something close to wonder. The seeds she'd planted with such hope were becoming real, tangible things, proof that life could emerge from careful tending. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the western peaks in shades of copper and rose, Ezra handed her a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Made you something, he said, his voice carrying that particular shyness he got when offering gifts. Clara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a necklace, a smooth, bare claw suspended on a braided leather cord. The claw had been polished until it gleamed, and around its base, Ezra had carved intricate patterns that caught the fading light. Ezra, she breathed. It's beautiful. Bear came too close to the cabin last month while you were inside. Had to shoot it. He rubbed the back of his neck, slightly uncomfortable. Seemed ashamed to waste it. Figured, well, bears are strong. Seemed fitting. Clara understood what he wasn't quite saying. He'd made this to symbolize protection, strength, his promise to keep her safe. She turned so he could fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin, warm and rough from work, and she shivered at the contact. Thank you, she said, touching the claw where it rested against her collarbone. I'll treasure it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing quietly for months. Ezra's hand lingered at the back of her neck, and Clara found herself leaning slightly into his touch. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until a night bird called from the forest and broke the spell. Ezra pulled back, clearing his throat. Clara felt the loss of his warmth like a physical thing. Inside that night, they moved around each other with heightened awareness. Every accidental brush of hands felt electric. Every shared glance carried weight. The careful distance they'd maintained for months suddenly felt less like respect and more like an obstacle. Clara lay in her bed, still her bed alone, and listened to Ezra settling by the fire in the main room. They were married, had been for months. Yet they still lived like cautious strangers in many ways, circling feelings neither seemed quite brave enough to voice. She touched the bare claw necklace, feeling its smooth surface against her fingertips. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would find the courage to tell him what she was beginning to understand, that gratitude had transformed into something deeper, that respect had become affection, that partnership was blossoming into love. The next day brought work in the garden. Clara was tying up tomato plants when she heard Ezra chopping wood nearby. She glanced over and found herself watching the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the steady rhythm of his work, the competence in every movement. He looked up and caught her staring. A slow smile curved his mouth. "See something interesting?" Clara felt her face warm but didn't look away. "Maybe." He set down the axe and walked over, stopping a foot away, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes, smell the clean scent of pine and exertion on him. "Clara," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "Yes." This arrangement, we've had separate sleeping, careful distance, it made sense at the start. You'd been through hell, needed time to feel safe, to know I wouldn't. He paused, choosing words carefully. "But it's been months now, and I find myself thinking, hoping, really that maybe you're ready for this to be a real marriage, in every sense." Clara's breath caught. "I'm ready," she whispered. "I've been ready. I just didn't know how to tell you." Relief flooded his face. "You're sure? I don't want you to feel obligated or—" She reached up and cupped his weathered cheek with her hand. "I'm sure, Ezra, you've been so patient with me, so kind, but I don't need more time. I know what I want." She paused, gathering courage. I want us to be truly married." He covered her hand with his own, larger and warm. "I care for you, Clara, more than I expected to, more than I maybe knew how to say." "Show me," she said simply. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it felt like coming home, gentle at first, then deepening as months of restrained feeling finally found expression. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing closer, and felt his arms come around her waist, solid and sure. The kiss held promise and patience, passion tempered by genuine care. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. "Tonight," he said, "if you're willing, we'll make this a real marriage. No more separate beds, no more careful distance." "Tonight," Clara agreed, her heart full. The day seemed to stretch forever after that. Clara moved through her tasks with distracted excitement, occasionally catching Ezra watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. They were like teenagers, she thought, with amusement married for months, but suddenly shy and eager as newlyweds. That evening, as twilight settled over the mountains, they came together in the small bedroom with nervous tenderness. Ezra was gentle, patient, attentive to her responses. Clara discovered that intimacy built on months of trust and growing affection was nothing like the awkward fumbling she'd feared. It was honest and sweet and surprisingly natural, two people who'd learned to read each other's silences, now learning to read each other's touch. Afterward, lying together in the bed that was now theirs to share, Clara felt a completeness she'd never known existed. Ezra's arm was around her, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said softly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. But they felt right. True. She felt him still, felt the catch in his breathing. Then his arm tightened around her. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Didn't expect to. Didn't think I could love again after Anne. But you, Clara, You brought me back to life." She tilted her head up to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You saved my life, gave me back my dignity, made me believe I was worth something again." "You always were worth something," he said firmly. "I just helped you see it." Clara kissed him again, soft and lingering. Outside, the night sounds of the mountains surrounded their cabin crickets, singing, wind rustling through pines, the distant call of an owl. Inside, two wounded people who'd found each other against all odds held tight to this new thing they were building together. She fell asleep in Ezra's arms, wearing his bear claw necklace, completely at peace for the first time in years. She belonged here, with him, and nothing could take that away. Or so she thought. 3 days later, a rider came up the mountain trail, carrying another letter from Denver. This time, it wasn't a request. It was a summons. The rider was young, barely 20, with dust coating his clothes and exhaustion etched in his face. He'd ridden hard to reach them, pushing through mountain trails that weren't meant for speed. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked, dismounting stiffly. "Mrs. Clara Cole?" "Yes," Clara said, dread already pooling in her stomach. He pulled an envelope from his saddlebag official, sealed with red wax, bearing the mark of a Denver legal firm. "I'm to wait for your response, ma'am. Been instructed not to leave without one." Clara took the envelope with numb fingers. Ezra appeared at her side, his presence steady and grounding. "Come inside," he told the rider. "Clara, let's see what this is about." In the cabin, Clara broke the seal with shaking hands. The legal language swam before her eyes, but certain phrases leapt out with brutal clarity. Breach of promise suit filed by Marcus Ashford against Clara Whitmore, now Clara Cole. Damages sought in the amount of $5,000. Court appearance required, Denver District Court, June 15th. Failure to appear will result in arrest warrant and criminal prosecution. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a dead leaf. $5,000, an impossible sum, more money than she'd see in a lifetime of mountain living. Ezra picked up the document, his jaw tightening as he read. The silence stretched, broken only by the nervous shuffling of the rider who stood by the door, waiting. "He's actually doing it," Clara whispered. I thought maybe after I left Philadelphia, after I disappeared, he'd just forget about me." "Men like him don't forget," Ezra said grimly. "They punish." He looked at the rider. "You work for the lawyer?" "Yes, sir, for Miss Margaret Hart. She's the one representing the plaintiff, Mr. Ashford." "Wait," Clara said, confused. "I thought Margaret Hart was helping the other women, the ones Marcus had." "That was different, ma'am," the rider interrupted. "Different case. This here's a formal legal action that Mr. Ashford filed a month back. Miss Hart's been hired by him this time. Though," he hesitated, glancing between them, "though I'll say she ain't happy about it. Made that clear enough around the office." Ezra's eyes narrowed. "Explain." The young man shifted uncomfortably. "I probably shouldn't say, but well, Miss Hart took this case because Mr. Ashford's got connections, threatened to ruin her practice if she didn't represent him. But she's been asking questions, digging into his background. Think she's looking for a way to turn this around on him." A spark of hope flickered in Clara's chest. "She's investigating him?" "Can't say for certain, ma'am. Just know she's been sending telegrams all over Philadelphia, New York, Boston, tracking down women he's courted over the years." He pulled another, smaller, envelope from his pocket. "She asked me to give you this too. Said to make sure nobody else saw it." Clara took the second envelope, this one unsealed. Inside was a brief note in feminine handwriting. "Mrs. Cole, I've been forced to file this suit, but I'm working to expose Ashford's pattern of abuse. I've found 4 women willing to testify about his fraud. If you can come to Denver, bring any letters or evidence you have. We have a chance to stop him permanently, but I need you to trust me and play along with the legal proceedings. Come prepared to fight. M. Hart." Clara read it twice, then handed it to Ezra. He absorbed the contents silently, his expression difficult to read. "So this lawyer," he said slowly, "is pretending to work for Ashford while actually building a case against him." "That's my understanding, sir, though if anyone asks, I never said nothing about it." Ezra pulled out his wallet, counted out several bills. "For your trouble, and for keeping quiet about that second letter." The rider's eyes widened at the generous payment. "Yes, sir, thank you, sir. What should I tell Miss Hart about your response?" Clara looked at Ezra, seeking his guidance. His hand found hers, squeezed gently. "Tell her we'll be there," he said. "June 15th. We'll bring everything." After the rider left, Clara sank into a chair, overwhelmed. $5,000, Ezra. Even if we win, even if we expose him, the accusation alone could ruin us. People will hear about this. They'll talk. Let them talk. You don't understand. If a court believes him, if they rule against me, we'd lose everything. The cabin, the land, everything you've built." Ezra knelt in front of her, taking both her hands. "Clara, listen to me. I've got money saved, more than you know. 15 years of trapping, living simple, putting away every dollar I didn't need to spend. I've got nearly $8,000 in a Denver bank." She stared at him, stunned. 8,000? Why didn't you tell me? Didn't seem important. Money's just money. I had everything I needed up here. He touched her face gently. "But if we need it now, if we need to pay lawyers or post bond or whatever this fight requires, we've got it. Understand? I can't let you spend your life savings on my mistakes. They're not your mistakes. You got taken advantage of by a predator. There's a difference." His voice turned hard. "And I'll be damned if I let him win. We're going to Denver. We're going to face this. And we're going to make sure he never hurts another woman." Clara felt tears spill over. "What if we lose? Then we lose together. And we start over, same as we've both done before." He wiped her tears with his thumb. "But Clara, I don't think we're going to lose. Not with evidence. Not with other victims willing to testify. Not with a lawyer who's secretly on our side. I think we've got a real chance at justice." Justice. The word felt foreign, impossible. In Clara's experience, justice was for people with money and power, not for women like her. But maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. Over the next 3 weeks, they prepared for the journey to Denver. Clara gathered every letter Marcus had ever written to her, flowery promises, casual cruelties, the final threatening demands. She documented every date, every promise, every lie. Ezra helped her organize it all into a coherent timeline that painted a clear picture of manipulation and abandonment. They also prepared the cabin for their absence. Ezra arranged for a neighbor, a trapper named Cole, who lived 5 miles down the mountain to check on things while they were gone. Clara harvested what vegetables were ready, preserved what she could, accepted that some would be lost. The garden she'd worked so hard on would have to survive without her. Like everything else in her life, it would either be there when she returned or it wouldn't. She had to have faith and let go. On the morning they left, Clara stood in the clearing, looking at the cabin that had become her home. The rocking chair sat empty on the porch. The garden rose stretched green and orderly. Everything about this place represented safety, peace, the life she'd built from nothing. What if she never saw it again? Ezra's arm came around her shoulders. "We're coming back," he said, reading her thoughts. "Whatever happens in Denver, we're coming back here. This is home. Nobody can take that away." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his certainty. "I'm scared." "Me too," he admitted, "but scared doesn't mean defeated. Means we've got something worth fighting for." They climbed into the wagon, their packed bags settled in the back. As they rolled down the mountain trail, Clara touched the bear claw necklace at her throat, feeling its weight and meaning. Strength, protection, partnership. She turned to look at Ezra, this man who'd taken her in when she had nothing, who'd given her dignity when the world offered only shame, who'd loved her when she thought herself unlovable. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for all of it, for giving me a chance to be more than Philadelphia said I could be." He took her hand, raised it to his lips. "You were always more, Clara. You just needed someone to see it." As they descended toward the valley, toward Cedar Ridge, and the long journey to Denver beyond it, Clara felt the fear in her chest transform into something else. Not courage, exactly. She was still terrified. But determination, resolve, the absolute certainty that she wouldn't run anymore, wouldn't hide, wouldn't let Marcus Ashford or anyone else define her worth. She was Clara Cole now, mountain woman, fighter, survivor, and she was done being a victim. The road stretched ahead, winding down through pine forests and across clear streams, leading toward confrontation and consequence and possibly justice. Clara sat up straighter on the wagon bench, lifted her chin, and faced forward. Whatever waited in Denver, she would meet it head-on. Together with Ezra, she would fight. Denver was larger and louder than Clara had imagined. After months in mountain silence, the city assaulted her senses, clattering wagons, shouting vendors, the press of too many people in too small a space. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, casting shadows across streets that smelled of horse manure, coal smoke, and human desperation. Ezra guided their wagon through the chaos with steady hands, occasionally asking directions from passers-by. They found lodging at a modest hotel near the courthouse, 2 rooms, Ezra insisted, to maintain propriety, since they'd be under legal scrutiny. "Last thing we need is someone claiming impropriety because we shared a room," he said, though his eyes were warm when he looked at her. "Soon as this is done, we go back to sharing everything, but for now, we play it safe." Margaret Hart's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Larimer Street. A brass plaque beside the door read, "Hart and Associates, Legal Counsel." Clara climbed the narrow stairs, with Ezra behind her, his presence giving her courage. The woman who answered their knock was perhaps 40, tall and striking, with sharp eyes and greying hair pulled back in an efficient knot. She wore a dark dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd fought for her place in a male-dominated profession. "Mrs. Cole," she said, extending her hand for a firm shake. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming. Please, sit." Her office was organized chaos, law books stacked on every surface, papers carefully arranged in labeled folders, a desk dominated by an elaborate telegraph key. 2 other women sat in chairs by the window, both watching Clara with expressions that mixed nervousness with solidarity. "These are Ellen Whitmore and Catherine Chen," Margaret said. "Like you, they were courted and abandoned by Marcus Ashford. Ellen 3 years ago in Philadelphia, Catherine 2 years ago in New York. There's a 4th woman, Julia Reynolds, who'll join us tomorrow." Ellen was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Catherine looked younger, maybe 25, with the straight black hair and almond-shaped eyes that spoke of Chinese heritage. Both women nodded to Clara in greeting. "Thank you for agreeing to testify," Clara said, meaning it deeply. "We should be thanking you," Ellen replied. "You're the one brave enough to come forward while he's actively pursuing legal action. That takes real courage." Margaret gestured for everyone to sit. "Let me explain the situation clearly. Marcus Ashford has filed a legitimate breach of promise suit against Clara. In frontier courts, such suits are taken seriously. They're meant to protect women from men who caught them falsely, but they can be weaponized by unscrupulous men seeking revenge or money." "So he has a real case?" Ezra asked, his voice tight. "On paper, yes. He has letters," Clara wrote, expressing affection and discussing a possible future together. "He can claim she led him on, damaged his reputation by leaving, and deserves financial compensation." Margaret's expression hardened. "But what he doesn't know is that I've spent the last month documenting an identical pattern across 5 different women in 3 different cities. She pulled out a thick folder and spread documents across her desk. Marcus Ashford is a professional fortune hunter. He targets women with temporary wealth inheritance, husband's death benefits, father's business proceeds. He courts them lavishly, makes promises of marriage, then investigates their financial situation. The moment he discovers the money is gone or tied up in debts, he vanishes. But not before securing letters and tokens he can use for blackmail or legal extortion. Clara felt sick. How many women has he done this to? That I can prove. 5, including you. That I suspect. At least a dozen more who were too ashamed to come forward. Catherine spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. He told me I was the only woman who'd ever made him feel truly alive. Said his family would accept me despite my race, because love transcended such concerns. I believed him. When my father's restaurant business failed, Marcus vanished within a week. 3 months later, his lawyer demanded $2,000, claiming I'd damaged his reputation by associating with him. My story's similar, Ellen added, except he demanded $3,000 from me. I couldn't pay, so he spread rumors that I'd been inappropriate with him, ruined my chances of remarrying. I've been working as a seamstress ever since, barely scraping by. Ezra's jaw worked with suppressed anger. So what's our strategy? Margaret's smile was sharp. We let him think he's winning. He believes I'm forced to represent him, that I'm going through the motions of a standard breach of promise case. What he doesn't know is that I've filed a countersuit on behalf of all 5 women for fraud, emotional damages, and conspiracy to extort. The hearings are scheduled back-to-back, his suit against Clara, then our consolidated suit against him. Will that work? Clara asked, hope and fear warring in her chest. If we present our evidence correctly, if we can demonstrate the clear pattern, if the judge is fair, yes, I believe it will work. Margaret looked directly at Clara. But you need to be prepared, Mrs. Cole. Marcus will be in that courtroom. His lawyers will attack your character. They'll paint you as a scheming woman who pursued a wealthy man, failed to trap him, and fled west in shame. They'll suggest you married Mr. Cole as a backup plan, that you're unstable and dishonest. It won't be pleasant. Clara swallowed hard. I understand. Do you? Margaret's tone wasn't unkind, just realistic. Because once you step into that courtroom, there's no backing out. Your past will be dissected publicly. People will judge you. Even if we win, some will always believe Marcus's version of events. Ezra took Clara's hand. We know the risks. We're still going forward. Margaret studied them both, then nodded with satisfaction. Good, because I didn't go through all this trouble to lose. She pulled out another stack of papers. Now, let's prepare. I need every detail of your relationship with Marcus, Clara. Every letter, every promise, every moment where he showed interest in your finances. Nothing is too small or too embarrassing to mention. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Clara recounted her entire relationship with Marcus, the charming courtship, the subtle questions about her father's business, the way his attention had intensified when he thought she'd inherit substantial wealth. She produced the letters he'd written, each one dripping with false sentiment and calculated manipulation. Ellen and Catherine shared their stories too, and the similarities were striking. Marcus had used the same phrases with all of them. You make me feel alive. My family will understand. We'll build a beautiful life together. He'd asked the same probing questions about finances, always wrapped in concern or future planning. And he'd vanished with the same cold efficiency when the money proved illusory. He's not just a fortune hunter, Margaret said grimly. He's a professional. This is how he makes his living, targeting vulnerable women, extracting what he can, then using legal intimidation to squeeze out more. The 4th woman, Julia Reynolds, arrived the next morning. She was older than the others, perhaps 45, with grey-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much hardship. Her story was the most heartbreaking. Marcus had courted her after her husband's death, convinced her to invest her widow's pension in a business venture he claimed to be managing, then vanished with every dollar. When she threatened to report him to authorities, his lawyers had filed harassment charges against her. "I was this close to losing everything," Julia said, her voice shaking. "My home, my reputation, everything. If Miss Hart hadn't found me, I hadn't offered to represent me without fee, I don't know what I would have done." The 5 women and Ezra spent 2 days preparing for trial. Margaret drilled them on testimony, anticipated every question Marcus's lawyers might ask, helped them present their stories with clarity and dignity. She taught them to stay calm under attack, to speak firmly but not emotionally, to let the facts speak for themselves. On the evening before the trial, Clara stood at the window of her hotel room, looking out at Denver's gaslit streets. Tomorrow would determine everything: her future, Ezra's financial security, whether justice existed for women like her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Ezra standing there with a small package. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Figured you might need company." He held out the package. "Got you something." Inside was a new dress, deep blue, simple but well made, appropriate for court. The color matched the torn dress she'd arrived in all those months ago, but this one was whole, dignified, perfect. "Ezra," she breathed. "Figured you should walk into that courtroom looking like the strong woman you are," he said. "Not the broken girl Marcus tried to make you. You've come a long way, Clara. Want everyone to see that." She set the dress carefully on the bed, then turned and wrapped her arms around him. He held her tight, his chin resting on her head. "I'm terrified," she whispered against his chest. "I know. Me too. What if we lose everything? Then we start over. We've both done it before, we can do it again." He pulled back enough to look at her. "But Clara, I don't think we're going to lose. I think tomorrow we're going to show that courtroom exactly who Marcus Ashford really is, and I think you're going to walk out of there free. Truly free." She wanted to believe him, wanted to have his faith and certainty. But doubt gnawed at her, whispering that women like her didn't get justice, that men like Marcus always won. As if reading her thoughts, Ezra tilted her chin up. "You're not alone this time. You've got me, you've got those other women, you've got a brilliant lawyer, and you've got the truth. That's worth something. Is it enough? We'll find out tomorrow." He kissed her forehead and left her to sleep, though neither of them would rest much that night. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. Tomorrow would be the beginning of justice, or the end of everything they'd built. Clara hung the blue dress carefully, touched the bear-claw necklace at her throat, and tried to find the courage Ezra seemed so sure she possessed. Tomorrow she would face Marcus Ashford. Tomorrow she would tell her truth in a court of law. Tomorrow she would discover whether a mail-order bride who'd arrived in torn clothes had any power at all in a world designed to silence women like her. She closed her eyes and prayed for strength, for courage, for justice, and for the morning to come quickly so the waiting would finally be over. When Marcus finally stepped down from the witness stand, Clara's turn came. Her legs felt weak as she crossed to the witness box, but she kept her chin up, kept her hand on the bear-claw necklace at her throat. Ezra's eyes met hers from the gallery, steady and believing. She swore on the Bible, sat, and faced Pemberton's attack. He started gently, lulling her into a false sense of security. Asked about her background, her family, her move west. Then the questions turned sharp. "Mrs. Cole, you wrote my client multiple letters expressing affection and discussing a future together, did you not?" "I did, yes. I believed his intentions were genuine. And you accepted expensive gifts from him, dinners, theater tickets, flowers. He offered them. I thought it was normal courtship. Then suddenly, without explanation, you fled to Colorado and married another man within days of arriving. Doesn't that seem rather suspicious? Clara took a breath, remembering Margaret's coaching. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Mr. Ashford ended our courtship the week after my father died, when he learned there was no inheritance. I had nothing, no prospects, no way to support myself. I came west because I had nowhere else to go. So you trapped another man into marriage by presenting yourself as a mail-order bride? I presented myself honestly. I told Mr. Cole about my debts, my lack of dowry, everything. He chose to marry me, knowing exactly who I was. Pemberton's smile was thin. How convenient. And now you're using this marriage to shield yourself from the consequences of your actions with my client. Objection, Margaret said. Counsel is testifying rather than questioning. Sustained. Mr. Pemberton, ask questions. But the damage was done. Clara could see some jurors looking at her with suspicion. She pressed on, answering each question as honestly as she could, but Pemberton was skilled at making her answers sound evasive or calculating. Then Margaret took over for redirect examination. Mrs. Cole, did Mr. Ashford ever tell you he loved you? Yes. Many times. Many times. Did he propose marriage? Not formally, but he discussed our future together often, talked about where we'd live, how many children we'd have. And when did these discussions end? Within a week of my father's death. Once he learned the debts, he stopped calling, stopped answering my letters. I heard through friends that he was telling people I'd been inappropriate with him, that he'd had to end things for propriety's sake. Margaret produced a letter. Is this from Mr. Ashford, written 3 weeks before your father's death? Clara recognized it immediately. Please read the marked passage. Clara's voice shook slightly as she read, My dearest Clara, I count the days until you will be mine completely. We shall have such a life together, a grand house, beautiful things, a position in society that reflects our love. Your father's business success has laid a strong foundation for our future. I am the luckiest man alive. The words hung in the air, damning in their clarity. He'd cared about her father's business, about money and position, not about her. Margaret called her other witnesses. Ellen testified about her identical experience, the courtship, the investigation into her finances, the sudden abandonment, the legal threats. Catherine followed, describing the same pattern. Julia's testimony was particularly powerful, detailing how Marcus had convinced her to invest her widow's pension in his scheme and then vanished with everything. By the time the fourth woman finished testifying, the pattern was undeniable. 4 women, 3 cities, identical methods. Marcus Ashford didn't court women, he hunted them. Margaret presented financial records showing Marcus had no legitimate employment, that his lifestyle was funded entirely by schemes and legal settlements. She produced testimony from investigators who'd tracked his movements across multiple states. She built an airtight case of systematic fraud. When it came time for closing arguments, Pemberton tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, as bitter women seeking revenge against a man who'd simply changed his mind about marriage. But his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. Margaret's closing was powerful and precise. Gentlemen, you've heard from 4 women who have nothing to gain by lying. They've exposed their pain publicly, subjected themselves to judgment and humiliation, all to stop this man from hurting others. Mrs. Cole could have stayed silent, could have hidden in the mountains and hoped Mr. Ashford would forget about her. Instead, she came here to face him. That takes courage, real courage, the kind Marcus Ashford has never shown. She looked directly at the jury. This is not about romance gone wrong. This is about a predator who has made a career of exploiting vulnerable women. You have the power to stop him. You have the power to say that women deserve protection under the law, that their dignity matters, that justice isn't just for men with money and connections. I urge you to find in favor of Mrs. Cole and to support the countersuit that will finally hold Marcus Ashford accountable for his actions. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Clara sat in the hallway with Ezra, their hands clasped, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. Ellen, Catherine, and Julia waited nearby, their faces tight with anxiety. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Harrison looked at the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "In the case of Ashford versus Cole, how do you find—" The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. His voice was clear and firm as he read, "We find in favor of the defendant, Clara Cole. Furthermore, we find the plaintiff's suit to be without merit and recommend it be dismissed with prejudice." Clara's knees went weak. Ezra's arm came around her, holding her up. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some approving, some shocked. But the foreman wasn't finished. Additionally, regarding the countersuit filed by Miss Hart on behalf of multiple plaintiffs against Marcus Ashford for fraud and conspiracy to extort, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. We recommend criminal charges be filed and award damages in the full amount requested. Marcus Ashford's face went white. His lawyers were already gathering papers, preparing for damage control. But it was too late. Justice, rare and precious, had finally arrived. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Mr. Ashford, you are ordered to pay damages totaling $12,000, divided among the plaintiffs. Additionally, I am referring this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Bailiff, take him into custody pending bail hearing." As the bailiff moved toward Marcus, Clara felt something inside her crack open, not breaking, but blooming. Relief, vindication, freedom. She turned to Ezra, tears streaming down her face, and he held her while the courtroom swirled around them in chaos and triumph. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it. It's finally over." The journey home to the mountains took 4 days. Clara and Ezra traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping to rest when they felt like it, taking time to simply be together without the weight of impending confrontation. The wagon rolled through familiar territory past Cedar Ridge, where Sarah greeted them with tears and congratulations, through the pine forests that smelled of home, up the winding trail toward their cabin. When they finally crested the last ridge and the clearing came into view, Clara felt her chest tighten with emotion. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, exactly as they'd left it. The garden had survived, though it needed tending some weeds, some overgrowth, but the vegetables had continued growing in their absence. The rocking chair waited on the porch, patient and faithful. "Home," Ezra said simply, and Clara heard everything in that single word. Relief, joy, gratitude, love. They spent the afternoon settling back in, unpacking their bags, checking on things. The neighbor had done well, the cabin was clean, nothing had been disturbed. But it felt empty somehow, waiting for their presence to fill it again with life and warmth. That evening, they sat together on the porch in the rocking chair, Clara in Ezra's lap, his arms around her, watching the sunset paint the western peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, ancient and unchanging, indifferent to human drama but somehow comforting in that indifference. "Tell me what you're thinking," Ezra said quietly. Clara traced the lines of his hand where it rested on her waist. "I'm thinking about that day on the platform, when I arrived in my torn dress with nothing but shame, when I thought my life was over. And now I think it was just beginning." She turned to look at him. "Everything I lost in Philadelphia, the money, the social standing, even Marcus's false promises, none of it mattered. What mattered was finding this, finding you, finding out who I could become when someone believed in me." Ezra kissed her forehead. "You found that yourself, Clara. I just gave you space to grow." "We gave each other space to grow," she corrected. "You were as broken as I was when we met. Maybe more, because you'd accepted loneliness as permanent. We healed each other." They sat in comfortable silence, the mountain evenings settling around them. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky, one by one, like promises. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said, her heart suddenly racing. Ezra shifted to see her face better. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung between them for a long moment. Ezra went very still, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, wonder spread across his weathered face. "You're certain?" "I've known for a few weeks, was waiting for the right time to tell you. Figured after everything with the trial, after we'd won, this seemed like the right moment." Ezra's hand moved to her belly, resting there gently, reverently. "A baby. Our baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" His voice was thick with emotion. "Clara, I thought that part of my life was over, thought I'd never be a father again after losing Sarah, and now—" He stopped, unable to continue, but his eyes said everything. Clara took his face in her hands. "We'll name her Sarah if it's a girl. Honor your first daughter while welcoming your second." Tears tracked down Ezra's weathered cheeks. "And if it's a boy, then we'll figure something out together, like we do everything else." He kissed her then, deep and tender, tasting of salt and joy and the particular sweetness of new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "We'll need to expand the cabin," Ezra said practically, even as his voice shook with emotion. "Add a room for the baby. Maybe 2 rooms, might as well plan ahead." "We have time," Clara said. "Months yet. But yes, we'll expand. We'll build something bigger, something that can hold our growing family." That night, lying together in their bed, Clara felt Ezra's hand return to her belly again and again, as if he couldn't quite believe the miracle growing there. She understood. After so much loss, so much struggle, the idea that new life could emerge felt almost impossible. But impossible things happened every day. She was proof of that. A destitute woman in a torn dress had become a mountain wife, a fighter, a survivor. A lonely trapper had become a husband, a partner, a father to be again. 2 broken people had found each other against impossible odds and built something real and lasting. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its rhythms. Clara tended her garden with new purpose, thinking about teaching her child to grow things, to understand the cycle of planting and harvest. Ezra began planning the cabin expansion, sketching designs by lamplight, discussing options with Clara. They talked about the future with a certainty they'd never allowed themselves before. News filtered up from town occasionally. Marcus Ashford had been convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His assets had been seized to pay restitution to his victims. Ellen, Catherine, and Julia were each rebuilding their lives with the compensation they'd received. Margaret Hart had become something of a legend, known as the lawyer who took on powerful men and won. But those were distant concerns now, part of a past that had been resolved and could finally be set aside. What mattered was the present, the garden thriving in mountain soil, the cabin being expanded to hold new life, the love growing deeper with each passing day. One evening in late summer, Clara stood in the garden wearing a new blue dress, the same style as the one Ezra had bought her for court, but looser to accommodate her changing shape. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had recently begun. The baby was active tonight, responding to the cooling evening air perhaps, or to Clara's contentment. Ezra came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her, his hands covering hers on their child. Together they stood there, 2 people who'd arrived at this mountain clearing, carrying nothing but wounds and hope, who'd built a life from that foundation of honest need and genuine partnership. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me. Really seeing me, when everyone else just saw my shame." Ezra turned her to face him, his grey eyes serious. "You know what I saw that day on the platform." "What?" "Courage. Real courage. The kind that keeps going even when everything's against you. The kind that tries again after being broken. That's what I saw, Clara. That's what I fell in love with." She kissed him as the sun set behind the mountains, painting everything in gold. The garden spread around them, full and flourishing. The cabin stood solid behind them, soon to be expanded for their growing family. The mountains rose eternal and protective on all sides, sheltering this small pocket of hard-won peace. Sometimes the moment that changes everything arrives when you have nothing left to lose. For Clara Whitmore, now Clara Cole, that moment had come on a dusty platform in a torn dress. But the real change hadn't been in Ezra's acceptance of her. It had been in her own willingness to believe she deserved that acceptance, to believe she was worth loving, worth fighting for, worth building a life with. The broken woman who'd arrived with nothing had brought everything that mattered: courage, honesty, willingness to try again. Everything else had grown from that foundation, cultivated with patience and care like the garden at her feet. As darkness gathered and the first stars appeared, Clara and Ezra walked back to their cabin hand in hand. Tomorrow would bring work and plans and the ongoing business of building a life. But tonight they had this: each other, their growing child, their mountain sanctuary, and the certain knowledge that they'd earned every bit of the happiness they'd found. The door closed behind them. Lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Inside, two people who'd been lost had found home in each other. And that, in the end, was everything.